Ukraine. I read in this book, Janusz is with us, that's great. First line in this book, I opened it at page 248, and I got a line about Circassians or Adigs, and just 2 days ago in our Ukrainian language broadcast we do on Monday and Tuesday, we had a long conversation with a couple of Circassians or Adigs, ethnic group that is still within the formal borders of Russian Federation. And we had a long talk of how and when there's going to be some solid development of the local, I would say, anti-Russian and anti-Kremlin movement, because a group of these Adigs or Circassians, I announced a plan to make a Circassian Adigian regiment in Ukraine, potentially within the Foreign Legion or elsewhere within the ZSU, within the military of Ukraine, but they are facing trouble with recruiting people from the Russian-controlled lands. Some of the people potentially are coming from Turkey, but this is a long discussion, and we started it last Monday, and hopefully we'll resume that with Janusz and with other people, and this is going to be one of the, I would say, mainstream topics for our broadcast, because Rostin Imperi.
Right. It's a great question. Janusz, it's good to see you. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Before we get to the answer of the question of the Circassian issue and the General Kavkaz, I think we owe you an introduction. Maybe not, because although maybe it's a small bubble, but I know Janusz Bugajski. He's a senior fellow from the Jamestown Foundation. He has been a policy advisor and think tank, motivating the think tanks in Washington, D.C. to focus on some of the more the issues that particularly affect this part of the world, that is the effects of Russian imperialism and colonialism. And not just from the sense of, he includes the culture, the strategic component, the moral component as well. And the irony of this isn't lost on me, that we are holding up a book of the Ukrainian version on an English language show about the Second Front that Janusz wrote last year. Janusz, thanks again for welcome to the program. Following a bit about what Oleksii is talking about with the Circassians, I was looking into the notion of the Kavkaz, and maybe Americans or English language audiences know too much about that part of the world, but it seems to me that that has a lot to do with Moscow's relationship with Tehran. And maybe you can tell us a bit about the complexities of that part of the world and how it figures into what Moscow may be trying to do strategically by building that new or resurrecting the old transport between Moscow and Tehran.
Oh, that's a good
yes,
one.
Thanks very much, Marco. Good to see you, and good to see Oleksii, and good to see Stefko. I see Stefko also there. And thank you in particular, Marco, for making the book possible. As you said, it's available. You sent me a little video clip of the books themselves delivered, being opened, being sent, and so forth. I'm very happy. Thank you so much. I'm hoping to be in Kiev one of these days soon, maybe to help, if not launch the book, at least to help push the book forward. In answer to your question on the Caucasus, yes, it's a very neglected area, unfortunately, in policy. And there's always been a danger that we've still, despite the fact that Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia became independent after the Soviet Union broke up, there was still a danger that US neglected this region, thought it was still some sort of Russian sphere of influence. Just shows you how this idea of Russian empire persists beyond the Soviet Union. And also, unfortunately, allowed greater Chinese and Iranian influence in the region. So I think a major policy turn is required here for the US, but also for Europe, particularly as Russia is weakening, particularly as Iran is developing a closer relationship with Russia, a much more destructive relationship, I would say. I think it's high time that we develop particularly close relations with Azerbaijan. This is a key country in the South Caucasus with enormous oil and gas wealth potential. It's the route to the Central Asia, to the Caspian Basin. They look towards the West increasingly for fear that Russia could stir a new conflict between them and Armenia. So yes, I mean, I fully agree with you. Caucasus is absolutely essential. We're talking about South Caucasus here. There's also the North Caucasus, and what my book does talk about are scenarios whereby populations in the North Caucasus, Chechens, Circassians, as you mentioned, or the Adig people, start to campaign for independence, for self-determination, for breaking clear of Russia, particularly once Russia starts to seriously decline, which I think it will do during the course of this year. And other peoples, there are other peoples in North Caucasus also, in Dagestan, in Kabardino-Balkaria, the Balkar people. There are various groups in the North Caucasus that could start to push for independence. Now, there's an additional question here. One of the things that the West has always feared is what we call Balkanization, what has been called Balkanization. So the idea that the North Caucasus will fracture into little states that will be unviable. We heard this with the collapse of Yugoslavia. Well, I think some of the activists in the region are now looking at resurrecting something called the Gorna Respublika, which existed briefly before the Bolshevik takeover, when the first Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire, collapsed. A mountain republic which included 6 peoples, if I remember correctly: Chechens, Ingush, Circassians, Nogais, Abkhaz, and one more I can't remember off the top of my Ossets, I think, as well. So they're beginning to talk about this, at least in emigre circles. And of course, a lot of this, I think, will percolate to the local level, to these republics in the North Caucasus. And that's something that will be of direct interest, of course, to Azerbaijan, to Armenia, and particularly to Georgia, which, as you know, borders most of these northern republics and already has 2 republics that have been manipulated by Russia to break away from Georgia. So again, I'm sort of outlining some of the questions that I think we're going to need to handle in the West, Western policy.
Follow up with you on this, because it seems that earlier, before we got you on the stream, Stefko brought up an issue about this generational change, or I called it a generational gap. Now, you've published over 20 books. You've been in Washington, D.C. since the mid-'80s. You've been able to see a certain transition, or the change in the caliber and quality that think tanks and policymakers have gone through since that time. And I think it's a legitimate question. Like, how did we miss something that Zbigniew Brzezinski talked about, which was one of the nightmare scenarios in the Grand Chessboard of a Russian, Iranian, Chinese triangle, an axis of sorts? Like, what has happened in your opinion? Maybe this is, it's conjecture and it's subjective, but it seems to me that we lost some of the heavyweights, right? And how did the notion of a pro-Russian lobby get into the discourse inside the Beltway?
Yeah, well, the pro-Russian lobby, I think, is of more recent vintage. It particularly matured during the Trump administration with a more isolationist foreign policy. And of course, Trump himself, who viewed dictators, not so much the Ayatollahs, but certainly Putin, as some sort of a role model because he was strong and tough, allegedly. But the Iranian question, I don't think has ever disappeared. I mean, there is a strong, of course, feeling on both sides of the house that Iran is a major threat, not only to U.S. interests, but to our closest ally in the region, to Israel, an existential threat to Israel, as well as a promoter of terrorism, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the world. So I don't think we've actually taken our eyes too much off Iran. There's a lot of debate about this, the agreement over the nuclear potential development of nuclear weapons. But I think now there should be much more focus for several reasons. One, as you mentioned earlier, Iran has a close relationship or wants to develop the relationship with Armenia and with Russia. and this could stir further conflict. The Azeri-Iranian relationship, remember, is deteriorating. I think that's one of the things we should be looking at. And one thing that's neglected is that there's a huge Azeri population in Iran. There's actually more Azeris in northern Iran than in Azerbaijan. So that's a huge issue as well for Iran. This is where particularly I think we should be focusing, as I mentioned earlier on, John. In answer to your question, I don't think we missed so much Iran. We have certainly missed expertise on Russia. And even the expertise that we did have on Russia was stuck on communism. We failed to see that when communism collapsed, the Russian Empire didn't collapse. And I do believe actually that Ukraine is the main victim of this lack of vision, lack of understanding of what is Russia. This was just one of the iterations, one of the cloaks that Russia used for 70 years during the 20th century. Underneath that, particularly, not so much under Lenin, but particularly under Stalin and his successors, this was much more, let's say, obvious Russian imperialism, Russian expansionism. Our experts, unfortunately, were schooled in the Cold War. There was this idea of a dividend because the Cold War was over. We weren't prepared for the Soviet collapse. If you remember President Bush at the time, the famous Chicken Kiev speech, of course, in which he urged Ukrainians not to go for independence, suicidal nationalism, and all this sort of nonsense. Instead of talking about suicidal imperialism, he was talking about suicidal nationalism. It just shows you how we didn't have sufficient understanding of the core of the Russian state, of the Russian imperial state, which wasn't communism. That was just in Marxist terms, that was just a superstructure. The infrastructure, the base of Russia is its imperial policy amongst elites, and that's continued since Tsarist times. Unfortunately, we don't have the expertise now that we did before. I've been writing about Russia's new imperialism since Putin came to power, so over 20 years. A lot of people poo-pooed it and said, no, Russia we can work with. The word pragmatic crept into our debate, which I think is the most ridiculous word. The idea that Russia was being pragmatic, that Putin we could work with. And again, each of our presidents repeated this in different ways. Now I think people are beginning to look at Russia much more clearly, but there's still a lot of work to be done before we fully understand the nature of this empire.
I want to thank you for raising the issue of Balkanization, using this word, because from a Ukrainian perspective, when we talk about the West and when we talk about the Capitol Hill and when we talk about the policies and politics in Washington, D.C., and when we look at Ukraine and Ukrainian perception of the Balkans and Northern Caucasus and Southern Caucasus, we have this gap of intelligence. We have this gap in understanding of what actually happens there. And so my question is very practical and cynical in some kind of way. We got the Chechen ethnic battalions here, a few of them. We got the exiled leader, one of the exiled leaders, but the one that is more or less recognized in the West, Ahmed Zakayev, who is a frequenter in this studio. And Ukraine recognized the exiled government and gave them a great chance to try to establish a couple of their own regiments here, which is very significant and important politically for the exiled Chechens throughout the world, because they feel and see a chance to go and fight Russia here at the only front line that exists right now at this stage of this global war. Yet, we got this Cherkessian attempts to raise the flag and to join forces with the Ukrainians. We got some sentiments throughout the Balkans, where we got Kosovo, where Ukraine, in a position of a main power fighting Russian aggression right now, has still not recognized Kosovo. And I feel like there's a pretty strong sentiment in Croatia and other places that could also potentially send a volunteers to Ukrainian frontline, that they don't feel like Ukraine is really into the global picture and is not really into understanding how important it is to recognize Kosovo, to recognize Cherkessia or Adig's land, to be more global in trying to unite those nations under their own flags and Ukrainian flag in this global war that is actually raging in Ukraine. So my question to Janusz and to Stefko and to Marek is like, hey gentlemen, what should we do with that? We Ukrainians, we whatever the Westerners. So how should we address this issue right now? Because it feels like this is this high time to start working really fast and going really, really fast to, to go for this Rostin Imperi, as Marek would put that.
Maybe
Stefko, do you want me to jump in?
Can lead.
You want me to start? I can start, not a problem. I've been covering the Balkans for over 30 years now, and I don't think there's a more pro-American population than the Albanian population anywhere in Europe. They are fully and completely on the side of Ukraine. They understand what the Ukrainians are going through. They suffered something similar in Kosovo under the Serbs, under the Serbian regime of Slobodan Milosevic, who increasingly Putin is imitating in terms of the brutality and the murderous nature of this regime in the Kremlin. So I would say Ukraine and some Ukrainian politicians have already reached out. And Mr. Goncharenko has already talked about and appealed for the Ukrainian parliament, the Ukrainian government to recognize Kosovo. I think that would be a huge success for Kosovo. I think it will also be a huge blow both to Moscow and its proxy in the Balkans, which is the Vučić regime in Serbia. So yes, Kosovo is one. There are other countries, of course, that I talk about that will emerge from Russia. Ukraine may be bordering Circassia or bordering the Kuban, which hopefully won't become a source of dispute, because parts of Circassia reached as far as what is now the Kuban, but the recognition of, for instance, the Circassian genocide, just like with the Holodomor, is extremely important. The recognition that there are huge diaspora. I mean, the diaspora of the Circassians, I think, is something like 7 or 8 times bigger outside the country, in places like Turkey, Jordan, and so forth. Ukrainians, I think, should be reaching out to these people in various formats. And in terms of battalions or volunteers willing to fight for Ukraine, I can tell you for sure that there will be many Albanians and other people from the Balkans that would want to fight by your side, because they see the common danger as Russian imperialism. Russia is destabilizing the Balkans as well as Ukraine and other countries.
Stavko?
Thank you, Janusz, for reminding us about the Chicken Cave speech. And I was thinking along the same lines, in these warnings of suicidal nationalism, and really that your point about suicidal imperialism is what seems to be playing out now. But you can't help but think that there's a feeling of deja vu with 91, in that the Americans are, or in the U.S. and in the West, that they're more concerned about the aftermath of a fragmentation and the control over the nuclear weapons. And I can't help but think that part of it is that nobody has a vision of or an idea of what Russia might look like after it is fragmented and has gone through the processes of denazification, demilitarization, and so forth. And I'm wondering if that's due to a lack of imagination on the Beltway and in other in European and American, Canadian centers, that the fear of the unknown, this fear that of these nuclear weapons ending up in the hands of like a Kadyrov or a Prigozhin type, which seems ridiculous, but who knows? And I'm wondering if that lack of imagination in Western capitals, or that fear of Russia falling apart, it provides kind of an opportunity for Ukraine, and who better than Ukraine after, better part of the country being 350 years under the part of the Russian Empire. And maybe it's up to Ukraine to propose the vision, like assuming that there's a victor circle in this war, and there's no reason to expect that there won't be, and Ukraine will definitely be in it, and can assume that the United States will be there as well. But those people in the victor circle are kind of that, victory is fine, but what about a vision for what, how do we handle Russia, and what do we need to be afraid of? What don't we need to be afraid of? And who better than the Ukrainian people to kind of say, hey, we know what this is about, and we've been telling you this for X number of years, and this is how it can be done, and in some ways allay those fears, that, oh my God, what's going to happen to Russia and the nukes? Is anybody giving those answers? Does anybody have those answers? Certainly the Russian so-called liberals or others don't seem to be, at least for my limited media consumption, proposing anything. They're just kind of waiting. It seems almost like they're waiting on the sidelines for things to play out. And, well, maybe it's up to Ukraine to say, hey, don't worry about it. And this is the way it's going to play out. Is that a reasonable?
Yeah, if I could jump in after Stefko, you raised some very good points. This whole nuclear question, I mean, Ukraine is perfectly positioned to talk about denuclearization for countries that emerge from Russia. Whatever the argument one would make now, that if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, it would have prevented a Russian attack. But on the other hand, I wouldn't approach it that way with Western policymakers. I would stress the fact that we denuclearized, as did Kazakhstan, as did Belarus. Other countries that emerged from Russia can do the same. So this idea of loose nukes used by new countries is a misnomer. It's an exaggeration. Secondly, I would say that, yes, Ukraine can take a lead role in establishing, forging ties with various diasporas, but also eventually with those countries that are emerging from the Russian Federation. We've already seen a little bit of this with the Chechens and hopefully with the Circassians. I would also urge that working closely with your neighbors, working closely particularly with the Poles and with the three Baltic countries on these questions. So you're not sort of out alone, seen as the breaker up of Russia. In other words, that you have a group of countries that are committed, that understand that the only way to prevent future Russian attacks is actually to deimperialize this country and allow the indigenous peoples and regions to go their own way and create new contacts with them, new allies with them. So again, be at the forefront, but don't act alone. That would be my advice.
Well, here's a provocative question for me. I mean, what are the chances? I mean, the bigger picture. I mean, I know it sounds almost churlish to bring it up, but the bigger picture for me is that if Moscow establishes or reestablishes or even finishes its dream, the Iranian ports were part of the delivery for the land lease that the United States provided to the Soviet Union during World War II. I see what the Russians are trying to do, what Moscow is trying to do is reestablish that corridor through either the Caspian or the railway land so that they can basically, you no longer need to use Suez Canal, for example. My question is that I agree that we need to talk with our neighbors, but what about creating new neighbors? What are the chances of creating, for example, a Kavkaz Federation that would basically, from the Caspian to the Black Sea, cut off access that Moscow is trying to get from the north south to Tehran, and the Iranians can't get from the south north to Moscow in order to hasten the rupture that we're talking about, because we're all making I think we're making very moral-based arguments, and despite my disdain, like guttural disdain for Mearsheimer, he's right that the U.S. foreign policy establishment has divorced morality from strategy. I think part of our effort should be to put them back together, obviously, because the moral component is I mean, it's important. It should be the driving engine of strategy, but apparently it isn't in most cases. And so what are the chances of something like that emerging that would entice the community that doesn't want to unite morality with strategy, so that they see, you know what, a Kavkaz Federation is actually in our strategic interests because it weakens Moscow, it weakens China, it weakens Iran. It prevents the nightmare scenario that Brzezinski talked about, again, in the book, right? It's an important question. Is that feasible?
And that's where Ukraine should step in. And because, you know, the problem with mixing the strategy and morality, that's the Western problem. While with us, it's the chaotic nature of Ukrainian policies and politics that are like, you know, we still got people who don't have them on board the presidential office, luckily, but they will promoting the idea of, occupying Kuban, which is naturally a Circassian territory, and which is one of the things that makes Circassians, the Adigs, absolutely mad about, Ukraine. Because what are you talking about? This is our land. And sorry, I just jumped in, but
that's why I say a Kavkaz Federation, that some kind of structure that would hasten their independence and also hasten, or at least begin that process of dismantling of that federation, or that ersatz federation, that imperial structure that the Kremlin seems to somehow always resurrect.
Yeah, let me jump in. Oleksii, you raise a very good point. Divide and rule has been a traditional Russian policy of subject peoples. And we see this particularly how they've used the Armenians, how they've used the Ossets to their advantage in the Caucasus. So, and you're absolutely right, Marko, some sort of mountainous federation, confederation, understanding even early on, even before these structures are created, how we're going to cooperate together, how it's to our advantage to work together. And I'm sure they would get support from neighboring countries, from Georgia, from Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, or the other side of the Caspian, who do not want to see an Iranian, Russian condominium across this region. They want to break this up. They want to have free access to the West.
That's a good point. I think that it's something that our foreign policy, again, right? And then we get back to this issue about the quality of thinking in various foreign policy institutions, be it the MFA here or State Department in DC. It seems there's like a lack of creative thinking to solve some of these issues. I bring that up because one of the things that there was a diplomat from the EU recently, he was on radio in London, Guy, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name, but it began with the letter V, good guy, and he had said that, again, I don't think it's armchair quarterbacking, but it's looking at the past and sort of saying something that may be obvious now, that if Brexit didn't happen, Putin may not have had the interest in invading Ukraine a second time in 2022. They look for those weak points and they exploit them very well, the Russian establishment, the Russian foreign policy establishment. Otherwise, how do you explain Lavrov's tour through Africa, through the African continent so often? These are issues that I would hope that your book is making its way through the swamp of Russophilia that seems to be rising up like the tide with the moons in DC. And I think that's one of my biggest fears, is that there's not enough creative thinking and gaming this out that we used to do in the 80s and 90s.
Mm-hmm. As a follow-up, Marko, by the way, And for our viewers, we are arranging a conference actually next Tuesday, Valentine's Day, on the breakup of Russia. Jamestown Foundation together with the Hudson Institute, and we have actually very good speakers from myself, Paul Goebel, of course, who's, if you like, the long-term strategist. For many years, he's been talking about the breakup of Russia. In addition, we have the foreign minister of the Ichkerian Republic. We have Mr. Gonchenikov from the Ukrainian Parliament. We have somebody from the Free Russia Foundation, a Buryat lady who's very much for Buryat independence as well. So it should be a good conference starting at 9 o'clock Washington time. And I think online, if you go to either Jamestown or Hudson, you'll be able to find the link.
Great. We'll put that in our description below. If you can send me that link, so that when this stream ends, a file ends up on YouTube, and then we'll just keep it there so people could sign up to it.
And Goncharenko finally learned the lesson, which is a good news, because he was also hot about this, I would say, very medieval and very inadequate and childish rhetorics that some of the local politicians were using, like Kuban is ours. Again, cosplaying Russian strategies, which is unfortunately still an issue in Ukraine in many layers of its culture. But he stopped doing that immediately after meeting some of the Cherkessians in Turkey. And so, yeah, they're slow to learn, but finally they learn. And this is just a remark.
Yeah, and
in the meantime,
if I could add how the Russians have been trying to stir conflicts between Ukraine and its NATO members. They're very successful with Hungary, but completely unsuccessful with Poland or Slovakia. But they're still trying. There's still this sort of divide and rule. That they're going to do the same thing between Ukrainians and the nations emerging from Russia.
I have to say a funny story that you mentioned. The Albanians, a friend of mine in London was having work being done on his apartment, and he asked the gentleman who was coming in to do the work, he says, where are you from? And he has that heavy accent. He says, I'm British. He goes, well, everybody's British, but who are you? He says, I'm Albanian. He goes, oh, I'm Ukrainian. And then they just went all over the whole thing with the Kremlin, that this is why it's bad, Putin, Huilo, all of the whole 9 yards. So when you say that the small data is what's, I think, to me, it's very romantic, because that's where the real policy is, right? That's where the real data comes from. We've already seen the mistakes. And I'm not saying to divorce ourselves completely from big data. What I am saying is that we got to keep the pulse on that small data. And you seem to be able to know, like, all of the small data together. And that's, again, I'm going to make a plug for the book in the Ukrainian language. But if you want the English book, it's available as a PDF on jamestownfoundation.org's website. And it's well worth your time to download and read. If you're a Ukraine watcher, if you think that people like Roger Waters need to shut the F up and brush up on what history is instead of regurgitating the Kremlin line, go to jamestownfoundation.org, Jamestown Foundation's website. Google will tell you what the address is, actually. And if you go looking for the Ukrainian version, it's on failedstate.com.ua. We have to take.
Yeah, one more thing. Yeah, of course, because we are. This is this minute of ads, and we're placing ads here at UMN, Ukrainian Media Network, and we got a wonderful group of guides in Iceland that are English-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking. If you happen to be Ukrainian or English speakers somewhere in Northern Europe, and you want to see the Vikings, land in Iceland and the fjords, and listen to Björk and and have some fun, distract yourself from a resurrected, a two-headed chicken, and just have fun and enjoy yourself a few days in Iceland. We got a group of people to supply you with this great guide, and with this opportunity to have
historical link between Vikings and Kievan Rus. A good opportunity.
That's exactly. I was just thinking the same thing.
That's the thing.
I was just thinking the same thing. In fact, there was a Netflix series And there's a scene apparently where Volodymyr the Great is in a tent apparently, and it's this Netflix series Vikings, and so yeah, there's a connection there too.
Anyhow, one thing
I've had a chance. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Stefko.
I was just gonna add. I've had an opportunity to read the book and work on the Ukrainian language text. And one thing that comes out, and this is kind of for Ukraine to think about, and that is and the messaging to the Ukrainians within Russia, right, that are living. I don't know. It must be at least like Soviet times, being a Ukrainian patriot, or fear of showing any patriotism or any support for Ukraine. But I don't have an answer. Maybe you do. Maybe you don't. But what is Ukraine doing enough to let the Ukrainians within the Russian Federation, who are, if I'm not mistaken, the second most populous ethnic group, are we as Ukraine doing enough to let them know that, hey, it's okay, we're going to win this, you can do your part, or are they so the citizens of the Russian Federation so far gone that their Ukrainianness is no longer relevant or important to them?
Well, you know how good Russians were at Russification, and in particular on the local, so to say, Ukrainians residing on the Russian terrain, and it's just like popped up in my mind when you were talking, when you were saying this. I just recalled again the story of Malofeev and the story of this Russian oligarch whose assets are finally seized by the Manhattan court a week ago, and whose name is not so popular in the West, but we're trying to promote it and to make it more, I would say, to make this case a breakthrough case. But again, Malofeev, for those who do not know, was one of the authors of the concept of reviving monarchy in Russia, and he was one of those to promote the idea of Putin becoming a new Tsar, technically. And so he, alongside with his Tsargrad TV company and the big chunk of the local Orthodox Church, which is of course again a KGB project starting from early 40s, but he was trying to do that. But ironically, Putin never needed that in the end, because he was the first Soviet woman astronaut, Tereshkova, who brought this bill to Duma, to the parliament, that gave Putin an opportunity to become a de facto Tsar of Russia without changing the concept of this weird empire. But again, who is Tereshkova now? And now when we look at the origin of her name, this is a Ukrainian surname that was Russified a few decades ago, a couple of centuries ago, I don't know, but this is a Ukrainian surname. So she is one of those Ukrainians on the Russian soil, who was Russified to become basically more than a protagonist to Putin, but to become his main ally in de facto turning him into a monarch.
If I could quickly jump in, Stefko, I completely agree with you. I think this is something that Ukrainians should also be looking at into the future, because I think as Russia weakens, a lot of Ukrainians who have been Russified, sometimes that Russification is on the surface. You rediscover your roots, your Ukrainian roots. And I think the Ukrainian population in the Russian Federation is probably much bigger than any census actually reveals. Particularly this last census, which I gather is a complete disaster, the figures, about a fifth of the population didn't even declare the nationality. But in the Far East, these wedges, green wedges, gray wedges, all these Ukrainian climate that exists in different parts of the Russian Federation. It wouldn't surprise me if increasingly that will fuel the movement for regional liberation in different parts of the Russian Federation, particularly in the Far East and Siberia. So again, this is something that Kiev should not neglect. These are people that are originally Ukrainian and that will be rediscovering their Ukrainian roots.
Yeah, it's a good point. I remember back in I'm going to mess up the year, 93 or 94, when Khasbulatov and Rudskoy had occupied the Russian Duma. I was in the Institute for Anthropology, and I showed up with my really bad broken Russian, and everyone around the table, we were constructing a database of ethnic conflicts, early warning system for ethnic conflicts, and they asked me my background, and I said Ukrainian, and everyone around the table said, oh, my baba's from Ukraine, oh, my dido's from Ukraine, I'm from Ukraine, I go there every summer. So there's that really interesting connection, which in many ways is sort of you kind of threw the gauntlet down too, because this is something that Roman Skripin talks about in this program we've been doing called Rost in Imperii, the autopsy of empire, where we find ways to see how it's going to end or what's coming next. And you come to the conclusion that a lot of Ukrainians had a lot to do with the creation either of or were involved in the institutionalizations of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and it's a history, I think that's where the Canadian experience, or at least even maybe the South African experience with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions comes into play. So that, there was an interesting article that came out today about don't overly criticize. It was written by he was an academic professor that was arrested, basically sort of a mea culpa as to why Russians aren't protesting. And it's an interesting point that Stefko brings up, because and that you're saying, Janusz, that if there is that many Ukrainians that could possibly coalesce into a some form of community, they could facilitate that kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission when things settle down, or when Ukraine finally emerges with its territory and sovereignty intact. It's a good point. Stefko?
Another point I can make, and I absolutely agree with the importance of looking again at the global moves that Russia's making, and in terms of what's happening in Lavrov's trips and diplomacies in Africa, and that certainly works with Putin's rhetoric of saying that, we're fighting the collective West, or the West. So by dividing the world into West and South, and us and them, and Russia is that messaging that the West we're at war against the West, is aimed at resonating in the global South, in places that might have had a bad experience with the Anglo-Saxon version of the imperialism, and that is something that again, it's more of an foreign affairs, but that I don't know if that's the second front, or is that already a third front that has to be fought.
Yeah, absolutely right. If I could jump in,
that's important. Janusz raised that thing. Sorry, Janusz. Yeah, just jump in real quick. You raised that one, and Stefko just said. And Lavrov is really active there in Africa and in the Middle East right now, after this huge earthquake that took lives of tens of thousands of people in Turkey and Syria. And they are, in my understanding, according to a few sources from Chechen diaspora, they are infiltrating Turkey by the means of some Kadyrov cronies that are now there with the rescue crews, and nobody knows what in fact they're doing there. just a little, paragraph on that. Sorry for
I was just going to say, in the bigger picture, it's clear that the more Russia is exposed as a colonial power, the more it's going to try and project that back on the West. Because remember, during the whole communist period, the whole premise of the Soviet Union was that it was anti-imperialist. In other words, it's actually a disguise for anti-American or anti-Western. A lot of our academics and a lot of policymakers that came out of that tradition did not view the Soviet Union, unfortunately, as an imperial and colonial state, which of course it was. Probably even more vicious than many West European colonial states, if you look at the treatment of different populations, particularly Ukrainians, but also many other nations. And I think that hangover continues, and Moscow's exploiting that to the hilt with countries like India. I mean, I'm in touch with these Indian guys who seem to think that Russia has never been a colonial country. I said, well, what hypocrites are you? What did the British do to you for all these generations? And now you are on Russia's side against subject peoples, against the indigenous peoples. I think, again, this is something where Ukraine, having been one of the primary victims of Russian colonialism, can forge better relations with African, Latin American, Asian states and explain to them exactly what Russian imperialism and colonialism and Russification amounted to.
Absolutely, and here
fascinating point that you're making. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
This is a fascinating point that you're making because it's been sticking with me since returning from London. That again, one of the vehicles I think that they use to exploit that or distort that understanding of imperialism versus occupation is the novel. And I mean, Eva Thompson in Imperial Knowledge talks exactly about the use, how the Russian Empire, the Kremlin, basically misuses literature and those forms of, I don't know what to call them vehicles, but they're like instruments of wielding power as the empire expanded. Eva Thompson is one of the few that talked about that vis-a-vis the Russian Empire, Soviet Union. Yet Western academics did the same thing, but they always stopped right at the border with the Russian Empire. I mean, even today, right, when you see these maps that we draw, and this is a direct result of that, you'll see Europe broken up with its borderlines, but there's just Russia, really big letters splotched out, and there are so many indigenous countries there, and well, no wonder that people are going to have this perspective that we can't negotiate, we can't let that fall apart. You get a fear factor probably in some think tanks thinking close to the National Security Council saying, whoa, we need to concentrate nuclear powers with these guys. This is the thing that I find, it keeps me up late at night wondering, how did their propaganda and cultural expansion work to that degree that it can convince Indians that they are the anti-imperial power. It baffles the mind that they managed to do this.
Well, with India, and that was a point I was going to make, because I'm coming to you from Canada, where you kind of get to go around the world without leaving your city, because we are a nation of immigrants, and you get to interact with people from all over the world, and certainly among the Southeast Asians here, you say Winston Churchill to them, it's a little bit different than Zelensky's Winston Churchill. You keep repeating that, but Winston Churchill for the Indian subcontinent has very different connotations, and that's also the if in the Russian rhetoric about the Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Saxon, that has emerged certainly more recently. I don't even remember that from the Soviet times. Anglo-Saxons, that seems to be a modern Putinist convention. But we have to be cognizant of that, and the Russians are certainly tailoring their messages to each audience. They know how to do that, and Ukraine has to be cognizant of that. That when you're screaming Zelensky's Winston Churchill, which is great for in London, but in New Delhi that has certainly a different connotation.
It's not very good in Warsaw either, as Poland as the first ally, was betrayed after World War II. So I'd be careful with Churchill.
Neither in Hamburg, Germany.
And it doesn't play very well in London either, frankly. The people I spoke with, anyway. But yeah, that's a problem with communications writ large. I mean, this is it's a small plug for ourselves. Why independent media has got such I think, a leg up on others, that we can see this issue is not exactly that's promoted, and it's not the pablum that's being put on the shelves of your average media consumer. Janusz, it's been we've had you for 45 minutes. I want to say thank you for so much time, for letting us manipulate your time like that. I hope that we can see you again. I know that if anyone's interested, that Stavko did a long-form interview that's on UMN with you that we edited for content. And I hope that we'll stay in touch, clearly, but I hope that we can have you back on the program.
And we wait for you in Kiev. And
yeah, and we're gonna we're gonna wait for you to.
I've enjoyed it so much. I haven't really noticed how time has gone. I've overrun 20 minutes that I was supposed to, but thank you. Please count me in for the future.
All right. Thanks a lot, Janusz.
Thank you, Janusz. And this book, the Janusz Bugajski, just he finished it a while ago, but we finally got the Ukrainian version of this excellent work. And so for those who read Ukrainian and English, this book is now for sale, and Marek Suprun is in charge. So here we go. In the meantime, I gotta make a little